Today, we're going to be looking at how to blend any 3D object into an environment using visual effects inside of Blender. So this is going to be a different style of tutorial today, just because I'm going to be starting with a scene pre-made, just because I don't really want to focus. This is more of a educational type video rather than a kind of step-by-step tutorial. So basically what I want to do is I want to match this car into the environment here and make it as realistic as possible. It's a super bare bones scene right now. I literally have my car model and then a ground plane that I have matched to the actual scene, and that's pretty much it. We don't even have render settings. And so let's go ahead and set up some render settings. Now, I highly recommend you guys render with cycles, since that's going to be our most realistic render engine inside of Blender. So I'm going to come up to render and then change it to cycles. And then let's go ahead. If you have a GPU, you want to use your GPU to compute, since it's going to be much faster to render. Also, if you come up here to edit and then preferences down to system, you want to make sure that you're running on optics. If you do have a RTX card, since I do, I'm just going to make sure that that is checked. And then once we have that, we can go ahead and I want to denoise the viewport, but I don't want to denoise the render, and that is because denoising is actually going to take a little bit more time to render out something, and since we're testing our render first, we can always set that to denoise a little bit later. I'm also going to decrease the sample count, so I'm going to do a 128 for my render, and then let's stick to a 64 just so we can get a super fast kind of, viewable thing right here. So if I hold Z and go to the render view, we have this as our kind of basic setup. So you can see we don't have any lighting, we don't have any reflections, we don't have anything in our scene, just the bare bones kind of, framework of our shot. And so the first thing that I want to do, of course, I picked a car because it's a super reflective kind of material that you would come across, and kind of the worst case scenario when it comes to visual effects is, heavy reflections, lots of, we even have a road that we need to match some reflections to there. And so what I want to do is let's go ahead and get some lighting in our scene, because lighting is super important for anything. So what I want to do is I'm just going to add an HDRI. So go ahead and select this to be environment texture. HDRIs are basically just images that you can use to import reflections and light data in your scene. Ideally, you want to be capturing this. If you are shooting your own footage, you want to be capturing an HDRI on the set location so it matches flawlessly. But of course, I did not do that since this is a stock footage I found online. So what I did is I went on Polyhaven and just downloaded the kind of environment that matches the most. You can see that we have a white sky here and kind of a road texture here. So let's go ahead and open up that image, and now we have much more accurate lighting. It's matching much more closely to our scene. Of course, if I do come out of the camera view, we can't see kind of anything out here. We can't see our footage anymore, and so what we need to do is that we actually need to come up to the render properties. Let's go down to film and set it to transparent, and now you can see kind of outside of our bounds, we no longer see the actual HDRI. So now we have really good lighting in our scene, and this is where you want to try to match the HDRI as close as possible. You can of course play around with some lighting inside Blender, but again, it is very nice to just kind of drag and drop an image and let the lighting kind of do its own thing. And so that's got us some really nice lighting. It's matching very closely. You will see our reflections are matching at all. And HDRI does both lighting and reflections. And so we need, of course, use the HDRI just for the lighting, but not the reflections. And so we're going to add some fake CG reflections. And the method I'm using is actually nice because it doesn't require any, 3D capture of the scene or any images shot kind of, on the side. So this is just an image I found online. So I'm going to just use the image data to give us kind of a reflection map and kind of work from there. And so with your own scene, whenever you're dealing with reflections, let's try to model it out as closely as possible. Of course, I'm not going to go individually and model out each tree and everything, but we will notice it's basically like a corridor, like an alley. So we'll have like a wall here and then a wall here, and then of course our ground floor plane that we want to keep intact. So just go to the editing mode. I'm going to select A to scale everything up. Just so here, I'm kind of looking at these sides right here. I want to make sure that that kind of matches where the actual tree line starts. It doesn't have to be perfectly flawless, since, we just need kind of a basic geometry to kind of model out. And so in your own scene, you just want to basically try to model out your scene as closely as possible. This is where I took it into FSpy, which is a program I'll have linked down below. It's a great program to actually kind of get your correct focal length of your scene. And so let's just drag this out here. So G, Y, move that out here, and we can just extend that all the way down. And of course, I do want to go ahead and extend the kind of wall up as much as possible. And now you can see that we basically have a huge kind of wall of where our actual objects would be in our scene. Of course, it's still white, and so you can see on the car it's reflecting a lot of that white color. And so what we actually need to do is let's go ahead and add the image onto this plane and then project it in a way that it's going to give us some pretty nice reflections in our scene. And so to do that, let's bring a new window out. Of course, you can do it to your own scene. This is kind of the workflow to do that. So let's go to the shading editor. And the shading editor is going to be nice because we can go ahead and add a new material to the object. And so we'd have this new material. I'm just going to name this the background plate, since that's just kind of my naming convention. You can, of course, name it whatever you want. But of course, what I do want to do, I don't want this to be affected by any shadows. You can see here we have some shadows and stuff like that. And if I play around with the colors, you'll notice that it's affected by the lighting of our scene. So you can see up here, it's a little bit more shaded and everything. I don't want that for my actual material, since I want it to be the actual color data of the actual image. And so you can see I just want it to basically be the entire image without any shading affecting it. And so to do that, let's disable the principled BSDF. We can go ahead, Shift A, add, and I want to add a image texture. And then I already have the image inside of my scene, so I can just press this button and I want to go to this image. And so that is the image of our scene. Of course, you will notice it's looking all wonky and kind of weird. And so that's actually where we need to go ahead and enable a few settings so that we can project, basically use the camera as a projector and project the image texture onto this object. And so that sounded very complicated, but trust me, it's super easy. First of all, let's make sure we have the Node Wrangler add-on installed. It comes default with Blender, so Edit, Preferences, Add-ons. And then if you type in Node Wrangler, it should be checked here, so you just want to make sure it's checked. And then now with that installed, we can click this node, and then if we hold Control T, that'll add a texture coordinate and mapping node. And then what we can do, you'll see that it's basically put our UV to be our vector of our mapping, which is plugging into the vector of our actual image. And so of course what we need to do is we need to set the UV instead of that being our vector, we need to set that to be our window. And window basically does exactly what it says. Whatever window you are looking through is what it's going to actually project onto our material. And so since we are going to be viewing it from the camera's point of view, it's basically projecting it from the camera's point of view and placing it on our material. And so now if I kind of zoom in, you can see that we have much nicer reflections, and it's actually kind of matching our scene a little bit nicer than it did before. I'm even going to go a step further, and let's come up here, have these two kind of edges selected. I'm going to hit F on my keyboard, and now we even have the sky kind of material on there. And so that is looking really nice. And funny, if I come out here, you can't actually, you know, tell that there's a border here. And so of course we have some kind of issues of it kind of, you know, projecting out here. It's very wonky and stuff like that. I don't really like that. So what I'm going to do, instead of it being set to repeat, I can set it to be mirror instead. And I just find that's a better fall off for kind of, you know, the use cases that I use it for. You do kind of want to make sure that the kind of reflections on your scene are matching up. And so they are for mine. And so that looks very good. What I'm going to do now is let's go ahead and get the shadow back. And so since we set the principled BSDF before and deleted that, we of course don't have any shadows. And so that's where the different kind of passes come inside of Blender. We're going to have basically two separate passes, one of our car and then one of our shadow. And then we can use compositing inside of Blender to actually bring those back. And so let's go ahead and set that up. So again, that is super easy. And so what we're going to do, let's first of all just set everything in its own collection. So I'm going to select this car, and then I'm going to hit M. We're going to add a new collection, just call that car. And you can see if I hit OK, it's added that car into its own collection, just kind of organizes stuff. I want to select the kind of reflection layer that we have up here. I want to do the same exact thing. So M, new collection. I'm going to call this reflections. Like that, hit OK, and now it's its own collection up here. One thing I do want to know is that we actually don't have that good lighting anymore. It's very flat and very, you know, not dynamic, and that's actually because the actual object that we have up here is actually blocking some of the light as before. If I go ahead and hide this, you'll now see that we have much better lighting in our scene. And so a way to get around this is to select the actual object, our reflection object, and then we're going to come down to the object properties. And this is very nice for, you know, if you need to set holdouts or shadow catchers or anything. This is kind of the menu that you come for. for that. And so we're going to go down to the visibility, and we have all these ray visibilities. You can play around with them and kind of work with what you want to, change in scenes. This is where you can get real involved into kind of the different rendering aspects of Blender. Very nice for kind of intermediate to advanced level users. So what we want is we still want the reflections, but we don't want it to actually be affecting the shadows and the lighting of our scene. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically turn all of these off besides the glossy. Glossy you can think as any reflections or anything in our scene. And so now with that turned off, you can see that we don't have it kind of ugly shaded anymore. I think the big one that was affecting us was the shadow. And so now you can see we don't have the actual object affecting any of the shadow in our scene. So that's going to be really nice. Let's of course come back over here. I do want to go ahead and add the shadow back like I said before. So we're going to Shift A, we're going to add a new mesh plane, and I'm just going to scale that up kind of where I want the actual shadow to be. So right there, again, I do want it to be on that ground plane because that's very important with getting kind of realistic shadows. You don't want it to be floating kind of above the ground and everything. Since this is an image, we don't really have to worry about that as much, but just kind of a good rule of thumb. Of course, let's hit M, add a new collection. I'm going to call this shadow, just so we're organizing everything. Again, this is going to make sense a little bit later as we get into the organization and kind of rendering out the multiple passes. And so let's go ahead and set this to be a shadow catcher object. And let's set that. And let's go ahead and disable the reflections collections, because this is a very important note, and something I want you to keep in mind is now you'll notice that the bottom of the car is very white. And again, so let's hide that. You can see that our shadow kind of plane object is actually projecting the color of itself onto it. If I disable the shadow catcher over here, you'll notice that it's its default white color. And so what we need to do is we need to make a new material that has a principled BSDF with the kind of texture projected on it like we did before. So that way we have both the kind of image data and also the shadow data baked into this. It'll all make sense in a little bit. So let's go ahead and set the shadow catcher back on. What I want to go ahead and do is I want to go ahead and add a new material. So we're going to come up here, and I'm going to select this material to be kind of our background plate material that we had made before. Again, this removes shadows and everything. And so what I actually want to do, you'll notice that there's this little 2 icon up here, and that means that it's basically using the same material for 2 different objects. If we click that, it's going to make a new material, basically copy it over to a new material. So now we have all this correct nodes, but whatever we affect in this won't affect the actual big kind of cube object that we had before. And so let's just name this kind of shadow for now. And then of course we just need to add a principled BSDF back in, and that will give us back our shadows. You can see there. And then of course we do want to make sure let's come shadow catcher off, and now we can see kind of what that is doing. And so it's still pretty white because it's being affected by the shading of the scene. And so what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and add a gamma node. And I just find if you darken it just a little bit, it'll match, try to match it as closely as possible to the actual footage. We also need to decrease the roughness, or sorry, increase the roughness and then decrease the specular, just because, the road actually wouldn't be, that shiny or anything. Parts of the puddles and stuff would be, but again, we'll get into that a little bit later. And so a cool thing that I like to do here is kind of just turn off, or we'll come up here and turn off the outline selected just for now, and then we can play around with the gamma. I'm basically just looking at this line right here and trying to match that as close as possible. So let's just keep increasing that. Again, it's not going to be seen besides the reflections, and so we don't need it to be super close. That's close enough for what I need. And so let's go ahead and turn the outline selected back on. And so yeah, so now we have the kind of shadow back in our scene, and it's looking very nice. Let's change shadow catcher back on, and that is looking really good now. And so now we have the shadow, and then we also have the correct reflections in our scene. The only thing that we are missing right now is kind of the reflections of the actual road. And so there are many ways to kind of do reflections inside of Blender. For this specific use case, what I'm going to go and do is I'm going to basically duplicate the car and then flip it under itself. And so it's basically just kind of a mirror modifier effect, but I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate it myself. So let's go ahead and Alt D. That's going to add a instance of our vehicle. And so I'm going to right click to set it back in its original position. And then we basically want it to be mirrored across the kind of floor plane of our thing. And so an easy way to do that is we're just going to hit S to scale. And then I want to scale on the Z axis. So hit Z, and then I want to do that -1. And that's just going to, again, kind of flip it under beneath itself. Let's add this in a new collection. So lots of collections today. So M, we're going to do the road reflection, just to kind of organize some things. And so now it's in its own collection. And now we are actually ready to go ahead and render out everything and, start our compositing process. So let's save the scene. What I want to do, let's come up to the compositing tab. I'm going to hit use nodes, and you can see that we have our basic render layers nodes. If I have the node wrangler installed, you can hold shift control and click and add a viewer node. And so now let's break up all this stuff into its own passes and, get to compositing. So the first kind of pass I want is where it's only the car. The car is the only thing that I want because it's our base pass. I still want the reflections and, kind of the collisions and stuff there, and the, ambient occlusion and all that. So to do that, since we've broken everything down into its own collection, I'm going to click this button up here. It just toggles some of the passes that we can enable for each of the collections. The pass that we're wanting to toggle is the indirect only pass. And with that now toggled, we can basically turn each individual thing into its own kind of layer. So for this core thing, let's think about what exactly we're going to need. We're going to need, we don't need the road reflection because that's going to be its own kind of unique pass. The shadow we are going to still want, but we want that to be, again, kind of the indirect kind of pass. So let's go ahead and change that to indirect. And then the reflections, of course, we do want that to be indirect only also. And so now we shall see that we only have kind of our car in here. However, we still have kind of all the reflections and everything looks nice there. What I'm actually going to do is I do notice that we're having kind of this black blob over here. And so I do want to kind of get that away. So what I'm going to do is just extend kind of this front end out here because it'll still project it kind of out here like that. And so now, it's not gotten away perfectly, but, you play around with it. I think it's actually reflecting some of the tree line and stuff up here. That might be what it is, because I thought it was the HDRI before, but it doesn't look like it. And so now, that is good for that collection. We're getting a lot of good reflections. You can even see the reflection of the road here, which is really nice. And so that is going to be our car collection. So we're going to make that its own view layer. So I'm just going to name this car. And so now we basically need to add another view layer for each of the different classes for our reflection and then also our shadows. And so let's come up here. I'm going to add a new view layer, and then let's do the shadow first. So I'm just going to name this shadow. And then, of course, we want to select everything in our kind of collections. We don't need the road reflection, again, because that's the object that we even made for that specific pass. The car, we do want to set that as indirect only. We don't need the reflections in this scene, so we're just going to disable that. And so now you can see that basically our shadow is the only view layer that we're not doing anything to, and we're using the car as the indirect, and that's giving us our indirect shadows and stuff here. And so that's going to be its own pass. Again, everything is transparent, so that is good. And so that is the shadow view layer done. Let's go ahead and add one more. So come up to the top, new, and this one is going to be reflections, like that. And then, of course, this is where that car, that road reflection thing comes into play. So we don't need the car. And then we don't need the kind of shadow or the reflections. So now we literally just have kind of the underneath of the car. Now this isn't ideal since we aren't getting really the kind of underneath indirect only passes from the reflections and everything. So let's actually try to re-enable the reflections and set that to indirect only. And you can't really see a big change because the bottom of the car isn't really textured for this model that I picked out. But if you did have something textured there, then you would actually see some of the changes that are made there. And so the final thing that we need to do is go ahead and kind of break them up and composite them together. So let's come back out to the compositing tab. Now this is normally a process I would probably render out of Blender and then, import it into Nuke or DaVinci or After Effects, whatever you want to use there. We're going to stick inside of Blender just to keep things simple for this tutorial. So let's go ahead and I'm going to Shift D, duplicate this 3 times. So now we have kind of one pass for each. You will notice that at the bottom it's set it to our kind of base view layer. So we have the car here. I want to set this to be our shadow and then this to be our reflections. And so let's just save our project, and now we just render an image and it should kind of update those nodes. Okay, so once that is done, we can come out of here, and now let's go ahead and try to composite everything into itself. And so if I hold shift control and then click the nodes, we can view each of the different ones, and you can see it's broken up in its different passes now, which is really nice. Let's go ahead and I'm going to shift A, add a image node to get our original image back into place. And that is this image right here. And so now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and start combining some things. Let's go ahead and combine the car with the image. So I'm going to add a alpha over node, which is basically just how we combine kind of different render layers together. And of course I have put it in the run section because I am notorious for doing that, and no matter how many times I do it, it's always in the wrong collection. And you do want to make sure you plug it into the image, not the factor. Today is just not my day, apparently. Okay, so now we have the car combined on our kind of road right there. And so now let's get the shadow into our scene. And so I want the shadow underneath of our car. So let's combine it before this alpha over, shift D, copy that over, alpha over there, and then shadow there. And again, I have misplaced it, and so I will never learn. I'm just so used to kind of the nuke way, and so it's just funny. I never seem to guess right. And so now we have our shadow underneath of our car, and then finally we need, of course, add our our reflection view layer back in at the very, very bottom below kind of everything else. And so we're gonna shift D, duplicate that, and then we want this to plug into here. We're gonna guess that, see if we got lucky. And there, yeah, there we go. So I guess right. And so now we're basically having everything combined. We have the reflection at the very bottom of our stack. We have the shadow in between that, and then the car above it. And so depending on how many passes you're going to need, you can of course combine them any which way that you need. And then finally we have this combining over to our final image. And so all that is looking really, really good. And now we can actually get into the matching of the scene and matching the colors, all that fun stuff. And so the first thing that I kind of want to do, let's first of all just kind of stack these correctly. Again, Blender is a little bit silly in my opinion because they have, it's almost like they have the nodes switched up, and kind of how my brain works like that. Okay, so first I want to go ahead and color correct this to the environment a little bit more. So let's go ahead and I'm going to add a color balance node. I don't really know the best way of color correcting inside of Blender, so if you do have a better way, just let me know, since I'm kind of learning Blender compositing myself. Again, Nuke, or if you want a free version, DaVinci Resolve is going to be 10 times better to match this to a environment. And so I'm just going to play around with some of the values here, like that, just because it might be a little bit brighter in our scene. Also, it's way too saturated in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is add a hue saturation value node, and then just decrease that saturation something. I might also decrease the value just a little bit so we can match some of the dark colors. And so now with our two nodes like that, we can see that it's matching much more closely. Let's just go ahead and copy and paste these nodes up here to the reflection, or we'll wait for the reflection. The reflection is going to be kind of unique in itself. So let's go ahead and if I mute that, let's just work with the kind of these nodes first of all. I kind of like breaking it up like that, since the reflection is really what we're going to be doing at the very, very end. And so now we have this. I think the shadow is way too much, and so what I'm going to do, let's just shift D, duplicate that over to there. Fun fact, if you hit backspace, it actually resets the node, so it makes that super easy. And then I just want to kind of decrease the shadow because I notice it's way too dark. Okay, so after playing around with it a little bit, this is the result I'm getting. Again, I'm much more of a nuke artist, and so you can play around with it in your own scene to get a more realistic result if you want. And so let's go ahead and add that reflection back in. Let's deal with the reflection now. Of course, it does need to be blurred down, so I'm going to add a blur. Add that there. Let's do fast Gaussian there, and then just turn that up. Something like that. It's not going to be a huge blur. And then what I actually notice is, you know, in a lot of kind of reflections, it highly depends on, you know, kind of the light values of the ground. And so you'll notice that we have this puddle here, which is going to be much more reflective than kind of the ground over here. And so what I have found to work in the past is to go ahead and use a keying node. Or sorry, a luminance key node. I forget the naming conventions inside of Blender. So I'm going to use the actual image and affect kind of that. And so let's plug the image into the image of our luminance key, if I can plug it in right. And then let's view that, and you can see that's what it's doing. I basically want to try to dial this in to make this, you know, give us some values over here. And so something like this. Increase that, because I basically want this puddle, I wish I could zoom in a better way in Blender, but I basically want this puddle to be white and kind of the areas around it to be gray, so a little bit of like what we're doing here. And so let's just dial that in a bit more. We can, of course, play around with these values as we set up our kind of node setup now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that for the factor of my alpha over. And so if I plug the matte into the factor, and now let's view what that's doing. That's affecting the kind of wrong aspect of what I want it to do. So instead of actually plugging it into the factor, what I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a set alpha. This might not be the correct workflow, but I'm going to plug that into the image of my reflection image, and then plug the matte into the alpha. And let's see if that works. Okay, that's much better. Let's plug that out of the factor now. And so now you can see that we can basically have some fun playing around with the reflections here. Let's go ahead. I do want to kind of decrease. If you ever notice like reflections in real life, they're much kind of like darker and much less desaturated. So let's go ahead and shift D up our saturation node. And I do want to decrease the saturation a lot because if it bounces, basically the light bounces off, it desaturates it a little bit. I don't know everything about light data like that, but I'm just kind of basing it on kind of what looks the best. Let's kind of decrease this. Basically just playing around now. And this is giving us kind of much more realistic kind of reflections in our scene. You can see that we have a little bit of haziness over here. And so what I actually might do is Shift A, I'm going to add a color ramp up here, plug my image into the factor, and then image into the alpha. Or sorry, I want the matte into the factor. There we go. And so now what I can do is I can play around with these values, and hopefully that will give me a little bit more control and more of a visual kind of thing right here. There we go. And then I don't like these kind of blown out areas, so I'm going to make this maybe a little bit of an off-white. Okay, so something like that. You can see that that's adding some cool reflections in our scene. Of course, it's not like totally realistic, but that's kind of the workflow that I found that kind of works for me. If I was to mess around with this a little bit more, I can dial that in nicer. So this is kind of without that, you know, luminance key and, you know, keying that in. And this is with, you can see add some accents down here. I just really like that effect. And of course you want to play around with it yourself and get something that looks pretty cool. And so now kind of the final thing that we need to do is discuss the color management. And so color management is a very complicated thing inside of Blender. Basically, when you're rendering out of CG, the best color space to be in is filmic. And then when you're rendering with images or movie clips or anything that's kind of an sRGB kind of color space, you want to be in standard. So if I come to the render properties down to color management, you'll notice by default it's set to filmic. And so that's kind of the new norm, I believe. In Blender 4.0, we're going to see AGX. And so what we need to do, the kind of correct workflow, is to render everything out of filmic and then open up a new project and then do the compositing there in standard. That's a lot of headache for this scene. And again, this isn't really the workflow I would recommend if you're really, you know, wanting super high realism. I'm just gonna, for my scene, set this to be standard instead. And so now we can see we have much more accurate color data of these kind of sky and the background plate. Honestly, this is probably something I should have been compositing in to begin with. So, you know, we just want to set that to standard to kind of get a final render. So now we finally have this result, and to render this out, since it's just an image, it's as easy as coming up to render image and then letting it render out the passes and everything. You can of course denoise it as well at this point, but you know, I'm not noticing a lot of noise for my specific scene. And so here's our final image. Let's come up to image, save as. You can of course set all these settings over here. I'm actually going to turn it to RGB since I don't need an alpha channel anymore. And then let's just save it in a new kind of location. Let's name this car final and save image as, and there we go. Okay, so here is the final image that we got from this tutorial. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about all the kind of different things that you have to do in order to kind of match something to an environment. If you did enjoy this video, it'd mean a lot to me if you consider liking and subscribing, as it would help me out with the YouTube algorithm. But anyways, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.